So, hey everybody, I'm going to present to you the economics of domestic violence, evidence from Bangladesh. However, I'm actually not going to show you any evidence today because I'm pretty early on in my PhD, and I'm only going to present to you today the design of 2 experiments that I'm going to run this summer. So any feedback you have on the designs would be highly appreciated. So I'm going to first tell you a bit about why I would like to study domestic violence and which question I would want to answer. Then I'm going to walk you through a conceptual framework that will help us understand what might be the different motives for which husbands use domestic violence. And then I'm going to walk you through the 2 experiments that I'm going to run in order to differentiate between these different motives. And then, yeah, I hope I get some helpful feedback from you guys. So first of all, why do I want to study domestic violence in Bangladesh? Well, first, violence is very prevalent in Bangladesh. 1 in 2 married women report that they've ever been the victim of domestic violence, and 1 in 4 women report they were the victim in the last 12 months. The second reason is that we see a very interesting pattern in the data in Bangladesh, namely that violence is decreasing in income. In particular, I find that low-income men are up to twice as likely to use violence than high-income men. The final reason I want to study violence in Bangladesh is because there's a second very interesting comparative statics result, which is that violence is increasing in disobedience. What is disobedience? Disobedience are certain wife behaviors that both men and women consider to be disobedient behavior. Disobedience might be behavior that is financially costly, such as making a purchase without asking your husband's permission, or reputationally costly, such as leaving the house without wearing a veil. And I do not find that low-income wives disobey more than high-income wives, so it's not a difference in disobedience that explains the income gradient. So in this paper, I would like to answer the question, what is the relative importance of different motives explaining husbands' use of violence? And I think that answering these questions is a very important first step towards being able to identify interventions that can actually reduce violence. So the objective of this study is to assess the relative importance of different motives for violence. And in particular, I'm differentiating between 3 different motives. Idiosyncratic violence, which is violence that is independent of disobedience. So basically, it's violence that directly increases the husband's utility. Reaction violence, which is the ex-post violence that the husband chooses to punish a level of disobedience once it realized. And the deterrence violence, which is the violence that a husband would commit to ex ante to deter disobedience. The methodology I'm going to use to differentiate between these 3 motives of violence is 1, a behavioral experiment, in which a woman gets the option to disobey and a man may punish or not. So this will allow me to understand or to assess the relative importance of these different motives of violence in gender-based violence. And 2, I would like to run a survey experiment in which I will elicit beliefs and norms about violence in a vignette study in order to assess the role that these different motives for violence play in actual husband-wife relationships. And finally, I'm going to run a multi-arm intervention that is targeting the motives that I find to be important in the first two experiments, but I'm not going to speak about the intervention today at all. So I'm going to now tell you a bit about how I think the conceptual framework that I have that will help us understand of why husbands might use violence. What are the different motives for them to use violence? So let's consider a simple full information extensive form game between a wife and a husband. In the first period, the husband commits to a punishment schedule. So he announces a level of violence for every potential level of disobedience. And in the second stage, the wife then chooses her level of disobedience as a function of the punishment she would face for the disobedience she chooses. And considering that the wife's utility is increasing in disobedience and consumption and decreasing in violence, and the husband's utility is increasing in consumption, increasing in social image, decreasing in disobedience, and might be increasing or decreasing in violence. Why is the wife's utility increasing in disobedience? Consider disobedience a function of effort. So which different motives for violence does this conceptual framework provide? First, there might be idiosyncratic violence. Idiosyncratic violence is violence that is independent of disobedience. So it's basically violence that directly increases the husband's utility. Why would violence increase his utility? It might be that 1, he has a taste for violence, or 2, that violence increases his social image. Second, the conceptual framework predicts that there might be reaction violence. Reaction violence is the violence that the husband would choose ex post once disobedience realizes. There might be 2 types of reaction violence: cold state reaction and hot state reaction. The cold state reaction is the violence that is ex post optimal, once disobedience realized. So it might be either that he has a taste for punishment, or that violence restores his social image ex post once disobedience realized. Think about the neighbors of a man observing that his wife disobeys. If they observe the disobedience, they're going to attribute her disobedience to his type. They're going to say he's a weak man, he doesn't have his wife under control. However, if the husband punishes his wife publicly observable, they might attribute her behavior to her type. They will say he did everything correctly, he punished her appropriately, so it must be her fault, she's the bad wife. The second reaction violence that we might see is hot state reaction. Hot state reaction is violence that is not ex post optimal. So hot state reaction is basically triggered, is a loss of control that is triggered by the wife's disobedience. And then finally, there might be deterrence violence. So deterrence violence is the ex ante violence, or the violence that is ex ante optimal for the husband. The violence he would want to commit to ex ante to deter disobedience. He might want to deter disobedience, one, because he has a distaste for disobedience, or because disobedience decreases his social image or his consumption. As you can see here, the idiosyncratic violence is disobedience independent. It realizes no matter what the wife chooses. However, the reaction violence and deterrence violence are disobedience dependent. So reaction violence and deterrence violence by itself might also already be able to explain the first comparative static result that violence is increasing in disobedience. So how would we want to decompose violence and its different motives in an ideal lab experiment? In an ideal lab experiment, we would vary disobedience and estimate violence as a function of the disobedience that is realized. If there was a level of violence that realizes no matter the level of disobedience, so even for a zero level of disobedience, then we would attribute this violence to idiosyncratic violence, the violence that does not depend on disobedience. If we were then able to also elicit the ex post violence, so the violence that the husband chooses once disobedience realized and he cannot affect the wife's behavior anymore, then we would attribute the difference between this ex post chosen level of violence and the level of violence that realizes regardless of the level of disobedience of the wife to reaction violence. If we were now also able to elicit the ex ante violence, so the violence that a husband would want to commit to ex ante, then we could attribute the difference between this ex ante level of violence and the ex post level of violence to deterrence violence. So the difference between these two punishments is that the ex post violence cannot influence the wife's behavior anymore, while the ex ante committed violence can still affect the wife's behavior. So that's why the difference between the two is the deterrence violence. In this way, we would decompose the violence into its three different motives. So how would we differentiate between hot state and cold state violence? To differentiate between hot state and cold state violence, we could also elicit the husband's punishment once disobedience realized and once he knows which level of disobedience realizes. So the cold state violence is the level of violence he would choose when disobedience realized, but he doesn't know which level of disobedience realized. While the hot state violence is the level of disobedience, the level of violence he would choose when he knows which level of disobedience realized. So how am I going to differentiate between these three motives for violence in the lab? I'm going to play a behavioral experiment that will allow me to assess the importance of the different motives for violence in the relationship between men and women. I'm going to create experiment couples, so virtual couples, meaning every man in one village is matched with a woman in another village, and they're matched anonymously. And I'm going to match the couples by income, and I'm going to provide each of the players some basic information about the other person that they're playing with. I'm doing this in order to fix their beliefs about the person that they're playing with in this game. In the game, the woman is going to choose between a small and a large plate of rice. With a small probability, the man is then going to receive the other plate of rice, so the one that the woman doesn't choose for herself. And with a large plate probability, he's going to receive the large plate anyways. I'm going to consider it a disobedience if the woman gives herself the large plate of rice. Why is that a disobedience? Because in traditional Bangladeshi families, women prepare the food in the household, then give the food to all the men, who eat first and give the leftovers to the women. So for a woman to choose her level of her rise first would be a disobedience in a man-woman relationship, not necessarily only in the husband-wife relationship. And why am I only implementing her choice with a small probability? Because I want her disobedience, her choice, to be not consumption costly. I want to test whether a man really actually care about her intentions and not about the cost that her choice has to his consumption. But in all of the cases, I'm going to tell him what rise she chose. So I forgot my water bottle. So then how am I going to differentiate between the three motives for violence? In the game, the man can punish the woman for each of the choices she does. And he can punish her in the terms of seconds she needs to listen to an annoying sound. Imagine something like the sound of someone scratching their fingernails on a blackboard. In order to reduce response bias and social desirability bias, I'm going to give the man a tablet on which he can choose on a slider how much to punish the woman. So I'm going to tell him that the woman is wearing the earphones at the time, and that whatever he chooses on the tablet is going to be implemented on her earphones. Neither the enumerator he plays with, nor the enumerator the woman is playing with, knows what he chooses. At the same time, the man is also wearing earphones, and whatever we implement on her earphones, a fraction of which is going to be implemented on his earphones. So I'm basically having men punish having men pay for the punishment. I'm doing that because in a real husband and wife relationship, one might think that husbands do pay utility costs for beating their wives. So since they're not playing with their real wives, I'm going to try to mimic that they actually have to pay a cost for punishing their wife. And I'm using the sound, the annoying sound, as a punishment because it has no health consequences whatsoever, and it cannot serve as an example for violence in the future. It's not something that they can easily start using as a punishment for their real wives. And I'm obviously not playing with the real wives because I'm concerned that this might have consequences for the relationship afterwards. So I'm going to play the game twice with every man, with two different women. In one of the games, I'm going to elicit the ex post punishment for each choice using the strategy method. So once her disobedience realized, I'm going to ask him, she already made her choice. If she chose the small plate for herself, how much do you want to punish her? And if she chooses the large plate for herself, how much do you want to punish her? In the ex ante punishment version, which I'm going to play with a different woman, I'm going to also use the strategy method to elicit the punishment ex ante. So I'm asking him, how much would you want to punish her for each of the choices she does? And I'm telling the man that I'm going to give this punishment schedule to the woman, so she knows the level of punishment she's facing for each of the possible choices. So the difference between these two punishments is that in the ex ante punishment, he can still influence the wife behavior. In the ex post punishment, he cannot influence the wife behavior. But in neither of the cases, he knows which level of disobedience has realized. So if we think again back about the conceptual framework, the level of punishment that I will observe, even for zero disobedience, even when the woman does not disobey, I'm going to assign to idiosyncratic violence. For the disobedient case, the difference between the ex post punishment and the idiosyncratic violence is going to be the reaction violence, and the difference between the ex ante punishment in the disobedient case and the ex post punishment in this disobedient case is going to be the deterrence violence. To differentiate between hot state and cold state reaction, I'm going to have a treatment, or I'm going to across subjects assign either subjects to a hot punishment or cold punishment state. In the cold punishment state, I use the strategy method to elicit the punishment after the disobedience occurred, but without the husband knowing which level of disobedience occurred. In the ex-hot punishment, I'm eliciting the punishment for the realized choice. So I'm telling them the choice that the woman made and elicit their punishment for this. So if there is hot state violence, then we should see that the punishment in the hot state should be larger than the one in the cold state. So what might be some of the concerns that you might have with the setup? First, one might be concerned that there's anchoring. In order to test that husbands do not just give me a response for one of the disobedient cases and then think they need to have either a lower or a larger response for the other case, I'm going to randomly vary the order in which I both elicit the ex ante and the ex post punishment, as well as the punishment in the obedient and the disobedient case, without announcing it to the man. So they don't know that they will be asked to both of the questions. If there is anchoring, then the order in which I ask the question should matter. A second concern that you might have is that this is not actually about intentions. Men do not care about what the intention of the woman was. They only care about the outcome. And they're concerned about the fact that the outcome in this case is uneven. In order to test this, I'm going to have in a random subsample a computer implement the division. So a computer is going to make the choice. If men really only care about outcomes, we shouldn't see different punishment behavior whether or not the woman or the computer chose the division. Then someone might be concerned that this is not about female disobedience, that men would react in the same way no matter with who they play with. To test for this concern, I'm going to play the game in a random subset, man punishing man. If really men do not care about who the other player is, they should punish equally when playing with a man than when playing with a woman. And finally, one might be concerned that the difference between the ex post and the ex ante punishment is not due to deterrence, but simply time inconsistency. Because in one case, I elicit before she makes her choice, and in the other case, I elicit after she makes her choice. To test for this concern, I'm going to have in a random subsample an ex ante elicitation without giving the punishment schedule to the woman. So if I elicit the punishment ex ante and tell the man that I'm not going to provide this punishment schedule to the woman, he knows he cannot influence her behavior. So if this is not about deterrence, but about time inconsistency, then we shouldn't see a different punishment behavior on the side of the man, whether or not I tell the schedule to the woman. And finally, two extensions is one, in the conceptual framework, social image concerns matter. So I'm going to test whether or not the punishment changes when I make either the disobedience public or when I make the punishments public. So in this case, we can test whether social image concern matter for deterrence of disobedience and whether social image concern matter for restoring a reputation. And secondly, I'm going to check whether consumption concerns matter. To test this, I'm actually going to, in a subset, implement the woman's choice with a large probability. So in this case, disobedience is going to be consumption costly for the man. So the behavioral experiment allows me to understand the importance of different motives for violence in the relationship between men and women. So I'm looking here just at gender-based violence. In the survey experiment, I want to assess whether these motives for violence actually also matter in real husband-wife relationships. So in the survey experiment, I'm going to use vignettes to test the role of idiosyncratic reaction and deterrence violence among couples. I'm going to show respondents two vignettes. In the first vignette, you're going to see a husband who gives an explicit instruction to his wife to not do a certain behavior. I'm then going to elicit the respondent's beliefs about whether or not the husband announces ex ante violence in order to deter the disobedience. In the second vignette, I'm then going to show a randomly varied level of disobedience. And I'm going to elicit their beliefs about the likelihood that the husband is going to punish this level of disobedience ex post. And I'm going to elicit the beliefs in three different ways. I'm going to elicit the self-reported beliefs. So I'm going to ask, what would you do? What do you think would you do in this situation? I'm going to elicit inferred valuation. So I'm going to ask, what do you think the person in this vignette would do in this situation? This allows me to, one, elicit stereotypes, but also see whether there's response bias in the self-reported measure. And three, I'm going to ask the respondents to guess incentivize the respondents to guess the village mode. So I will ask them, what do you think, or what do you believe was the most common answer in your village to this question? So the last way allows me to understand the second order beliefs in this context. And I'm going to elicit both beliefs, so how will the husband react, and social norms. What is the socially desirable reaction? This will help me understand what the beliefs are in this context of the likelihood of husbands using violence either to deter disobedience or ex post to punish disobedience. And it will also allow me to understand the social norms regarding violence. And for example, I could test whether it is really the social norm to punish your wife, and whether the acceptability of violence varies by certain husband characteristics, such as income. So, to summarize, the objective of the study is to assess the relative importance of motives for violence. And I'm differentiating between 3 motives for violence: idiosyncratic violence, which is violence that is independent of wife behavior; reaction violence, that is the violence that the husband chooses ex post to punish his wife for certain behaviors; deterrence violence, which is a level of violence that realizes because the husband committed ex ante to a level of violence to deter disobedience. And to differentiate between these 3 motives, which I think is important to be able to design interventions that can actually effectively reduce violence, I'm going to use 2 experiments. One, a behavioral experiment, in which I'm going to compare the ex ante punishment, so the punishment that can still change wife behavior, with the ex post punishment, so the punishment that cannot change wife behavior anymore. This will allow me to understand the role of the 3 motives for violence in the relationship between men and women. And then second, I'm going to use a vignette experiment in which I'm going to elicit beliefs and norms about the use of violence in different situations to test whether these motives for violence actually matter in the real husband-wife relationship. Yeah, thank you. And if there's no
man versus man is exactly the same as man versus women, then what are you left with? You know, so I would try to get more finer gray of what could be going on, like this example of different intensities of punishment. So what do you think?
So I thought about this. I mean, actually, yeah, this is an excellent comment. I thought about this before. So I'm not playing, for example, women against women or women punishing men because I don't have a prediction for this in a conceptual framework. There's no reason to believe that women wouldn't punish equally if they had the punishment technology.
If it's weaker, yeah, and it's repeated, it's not obvious.
So if it was a repeated game, you might get a situation where actually women use disobedience instrumentally. They might ex ante commit to a disobedience schedule and say, so yeah,
so
but the reason
where things can happen with sustainability.
Exactly, but because there's no there's no prediction on what would be the equilibrium that emerges in a repeated game. I'm not looking at a repeated schedule because then everything could happen. It could happen for one level of deterrence, like I'm going to punish forever, right? I have no idea what equilibrium would emerge. This is why I'm focusing on the 1-period model. But I'm not sure what would happen if I play the game women punishing men or women punishing women, because we're just living in a world where women don't have a punishment technology. But maybe once they had it, an equilibrium would emerge where actually women also enforce contracts by using violence.
My point is just that when people are playing your game, even though it's one shot, because you're pairing men and wives, quote unquote, maybe what they're thinking is, you know, the analogy of real life, which is actually not a one-shot game. So.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I'm trying to. I think that's a concern that they see it in a repeated game, that this is just 1 period in a repeated game. I've been trying to think about a bit how I can reduce this concern by not. So the actual design or the actual experiment never uses the word punishment or relationship, etc. But I need to think about this more. How to make sure they see this as a one-shot game. And the concern actually might exist even more because I'm playing it with rice, and that's something they know from the real world. So maybe I need to consider a disobedience that doesn't remind them too much about the real world.
And do this thing, like, you know, maybe if they do think of the reward and then wives do not punish men, even though they have the capacity to do so, that's interesting.
Yeah, think about that.
So it was actually the same thing where I see your point, but I would have also get, at the very least as a benchmark for external validity or for other things, also do the women against men. It's true there is no technology available to do physical violence, but I want to believe that I want to have some evidence that what you are getting there, it actually translates to real violence. So I don't know if there is something that you can gather from the survey. Maybe what about, I don't know how viable it is, but you will know who the actual wife of this man subject are, and maybe asking something in a way that is possible, asking something so you have something that gives you that direction. And there are other ways, there are many ways, I mean it's not going to be violence, but there are many ways in which wives do punish husbands, and violence takes it to a completely different level. But I still think it would be interesting if
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
did the women versus husband when the technology is available.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I'll reconsider that then. So I mean, what I'm eliciting in the baseline survey is I'm surveying all the women, all the wives of all the husbands who are in the experiment. So I'm going to elicit the victimization rates of those couples.
So that's great.
And so then afterwards I can correlate the punishment I see in the lab with the victim or with the violence reported by the wives of the husbands who are in the experiment. Yeah.
And maybe even the same with the women deciding whether to get the big plate or not, get their experience in terms of them being victim of domestic violence.
Yeah, I need to think about it. So I'm only able to survey the spouse always of the person who's playing. So currently I was thinking to interview the wives of the husbands who are playing and the husbands of the women who are playing. But it might be more interesting to survey the women in both cases. I need to think about this, but that's the point.
Of course, one would like to know it all.
Yeah, but I'm just concerned of surveying both surveying both sides, so both playing and then both surveying, even though they play with other partners, because then they know what's happening in the game, they know what the survey looks like, and they might speak with their partner about what they answered in the survey or what they did in the game. So that's why I thought I'm only either have one partner play the game and survey the other.
What about if you were to get couples part of the experiment, so they have to come in couples, but they all play with different people, so you save on the survey?
Yeah, I mean that was the concern with that is then afterwards husbands would walk to their wives and say, when you played, which wives did you choose? Or when they asked you this question.
They play with different
Exactly, but they might still ask them. In the men, like they might, even though they're not disobeying to their own husband, they're disobeying to another husband, right? So it would still, a husband might still consider it disobedient to generally disobey to any man that they play with. So I'm concerned that they would punish their own wives afterwards for disobeying to another man. Because there's like this very strong notion of women disobey to all men, not only to your own husband. So that's why I need to be very careful in designing this to make sure that I'm not taking violence outside the lab afterwards. But I think that women versus women is, I need to think about this one. I think this is a very good idea, I think.
Just a clarification. So the husbands who are participating in the experiment know that their wives will get surveyed?
Yeah.
About domestic violence?
No. They don't know that this is about domestic violence, right? In particular, Bangladesh is a setting where people are used to playing ultimatum games and public goods games. So this is another game that they're playing. And it's part of a very extensive baseline survey. So this is just one module, basically, of the survey. And I'm trying to drown the fish in a lot of other things. So, yeah.
Maybe just one more question.
And from the survey, do you have information on income or on who manage monetary resources within the household?
Yeah.
Because there is written literature that explain on the impact of unconditional cash transfer that shows that when the unconditional cash transfer is paid to the man, the intimated partner violence diminishes.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I would probably consider also some more economic determinants on your experiment.
So the second research question that I didn't have time in for 20 minutes is what mechanisms explain the income gradient in the use of violence.
Okay.
So a large fraction of the survey is focused on what of consumption income and whether or not disobedience is punished harshly when it's consumption costly, right? It could be both social image and consumption that explains the income gradient. If I have utility that is concave in either of these inputs and income is correlated with these inputs, then low-income husbands would have a higher incentive to punish because for them the marginal cost of disobedience is higher. So basically I want to explain, I don't think that income by itself is causal and that low-income men just have a higher taste for violence. There is some correlate that might explain this income mechanism or this income gradient, and I want to understand what is the mechanism that explains this income gradient. So that's like the second big part of the paper. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.